Okay, there are two very basic utility stitches that every sewer should know. The first is the basting stitch, and the second is the running stitch. These are two of your very basic hand sewing stitches. Now the basting stitch is a nice, great big stabby stitch. And I'm just going to be poking my needle in and out of the fabric. It's used a lot for connecting two pieces of fabric temporarily before you put the final machine stitches in. It's also used for marking important things on fabric in high-end sewing, like darts and princess lines and stitching lines. At a very high end, all of these are marked in with thread so that you know exactly where you're stitching. And I'm just literally great big stabby stitches. I'm using my finger behind the fabric to tell me where my needle's coming in and out, so I can kind of feel for that. When I'm done with whatever I am basting or marking, I'm going to make a very tiny stitch right where my thread ends to make sure I don't pull the thread, and wind my thread, my working thread that's just come out of the fabric, around my needle 3 or 4 times, and just pull through to secure the front thread. Then I can go ahead and cut that, and those stitches will stay in place. Tie another knot at the end of my thread here, and we'll talk about the running stitch. If you were to sew something entirely by hand, you would probably end up with a running stitch. I don't recommend sewing anything entirely by hand if you can avoid it, but there are people out there who like to do that. So, the running stitch is going to be a lot like the basting stitch, but much shorter. So I'm poking the needle in, I'm sort of bending the fabric around it, almost like I'm making shish kebab. And I'm going to get several stitches queued up on my needle here, and I'll spread those out. So you can see I've just gone back and forth in and out of the fabric, and then I'm going to pull the thread all the way through, and I'm going to keep going. In nicer men's suits, you will see hand stitch details on the lapels. It's kind of nice. I don't know of a machine in existence that can make this kind of stitch work. So it sort of says, hey, someone had to do this by hand, and that makes things nice and expensive looking. And I like for the work that I do to look fairly expensive. So I'm just going to continue as long as I feel like this running stitch needs to be. If I were sewing a garment, it would be the length of the seam. If I were doing something decorative, like running this along a neckline, it would be the length of the neckline. When I'm done, same as before, little bitty stitch right where my thread's coming out. Wrap my thread around 3 or 4 times, and pull that little knot that we just made down. If I were working something with multiple layers, I could do something about these nasty bits of thread, but I'm not. In both cases, the basting stitch and the running stitch, you're going to get about the same look on both sides of your work if you're dealing with a single layer. So there you have it.